After the flood, investigations begin, lawsuits are filed, and the neighborhood slowly rebuilds. Residents reflect on the cost of arrogance and the power of nature. The storm had passed. But Crestwood Estates would never be the same again. In the soft morning light, the neighborhood looked like a battlefield. Cars lay tilted on sidewalks, their doors open like broken wings. Mud coated everything, porches, walls, trees. Children's toys floated in shallow pools, tangled in fallen branches. A silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant hum of emergency generators. Lena Carter stood on her porch steps, holding her son's hand. The waterline on her house reached halfway up the living room windows. Inside, the smell of soaked drywall and sewage was thick. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her son stared at the muddy yard where his swing set once stood. It was gone. Across the street, Harold Jennings sat on an overturned bucket, staring at what used to be his garden. The soil had been scoured clean, plants ripped away. He held a damp photograph in his hand, a picture of the creek from years ago, when dragonflies hovered above the water and children skipped stones across the surface. His voice was low when a reporter approached. "The creek always took care of us," he said. "We just stopped taking care of it." The investigations begin within days. County officials, environmental engineers, and insurance inspectors descended on Crestwood. They documented everything: the cracked retention wall, the failed drainage pipes, the missing permits. A preliminary report concluded that the HOA had bypassed multiple environmental impact assessments, ignored hydrological data, and approved the project without proper drainage modeling. A class action lawsuit, led by Harold and Daniel Ramirez, was filed against the HOA board and the contractors. The county also launched a separate legal action for violating waterway protection ordinances. The once confident board members now avoided the press, their previous statements playing on repeat in online clips that spread far beyond Crestwood. A community rebuilds. Spring came slowly. The floodwaters receded, but scars remained. Streets were repaved, homes gutted and rebuilt. Volunteers planted trees where the water had carved channels. And at the heart of it all, something unexpected happened. The residents voted to remove the concrete drainage channel entirely. With county support, environmental groups, and local volunteers, they began restoring Black Man's Creek. Stones were placed, native plants reintroduced, and water was redirected back to its natural path. It wasn't easy. It took months of work, but little by little the creek returned. One morning in late May, Harold stood by the restored banks, watching the water flow freely again. Children played along the edges, dipping sticks into the stream. Lena's son found a tiny frog and held it up proudly. For the first time in a long time, Crestwood felt alive again. Looking back, reporters asked Harold what lesson the community had learned. He didn't hesitate. "You can't pave over history. You can't outvote nature. And you sure as hell can't ignore the land that holds you up." The HOA board was replaced entirely in a special election. The new board promised transparency, environmental respect, and community involvement. It wasn't just about fixing homes anymore. It was about rebuilding trust. Years later, when the rains came again, the creek swelled gracefully, carrying the water downstream like it always had. No alarms, no panic, just the sound of flowing water under a silver moon, as it should have been all along. Residents begin demanding accountability. The HOA issues evasive statements. A tense town hall meeting is held, revealing the board's arrogance and negligence. Crestwood Estates residents demand answers over rising floodwaters by Jenna Marks, staff reporter. Crestwood Gazette published January 8, Crestwood. VA, what began as minor pooling after December's rains, has escalated into a full-blown neighborhood crisis as residents of Crestwood Estates face persistent flooding weeks after their Homeowners Association, HOA, filled in a local creek with concrete. According to multiple residents, Black Man's Creek, a natural waterway running through the neighborhood for generations, was removed and replaced with a concrete drainage channel in late autumn. The HOA board claimed the change would modernize the landscape and improve property values. Instead, many homes are now surrounded by standing water, with reports of mold growth, structural damage, and inaccessible driveways. "We warned them," said Harold Jennings, 67, a long-time resident whose basement is now partially flooded. "You can't just block where the water wants to go. HOA doesn't listen to paperwork." The HOA's official response. The HOA board released a formal statement during a closed press conference. "The current situation is the result of unusually heavy seasonal rainfall, not any negligence in our improvement projects. The drainage system is fully functional and in compliance with all county codes. However, rainfall data obtained by the Gazette from the National Weather Service indicates that precipitation this season is only 3% higher than the 20-year average, contradicting the board's claims." Town hall turns. Heated frustration boiled over during last night's emergency town hall meeting. The community center was packed wall to wall as residents demanded explanations. Susan Marwick, the HOA president, began the meeting by reiterating the board's stance. "There is no evidence that the creek project has caused any of the flooding issues. We are working closely with contractors to ensure everything meets legal standards." Her remarks were met with boos and shouts from the crowd. "I can't even get to my garage without wading through 2 feet of water," yelled Lena Carter, holding up photos of her submerged front porch. Another resident, Daniel Ramirez, stepped up to the microphone with a folder of maintenance records and a sharp voice. "You didn't even conduct a hydrology assessment. I work in civil engineering. You skipped the most basic steps." Board members exchanged uneasy glances, but offered no direct answer. County involvement. The county's Environmental Services Department has confirmed that it received multiple complaints and has opened an investigation. Officials are expected to visit Crestwood next week to assess whether the HOA violated local waterway protection ordinances. Meanwhile, residents are organizing their own committee, independent of the HOA, to gather evidence and potentially file a class action lawsuit. "They thought this was just a ditch," Harold said after the meeting, shaking his head. "Well, that ditch is fighting back. Looking ahead, more rain is forecasted for later this month, and many fear the worst is yet to come." As Crestwood Estates braces for another storm, tensions between residents and the HOA board are at an all-time high. This is a developing story. Updates will follow as the investigation continues. A massive storm hits. The drainage system collapses. The neighborhood floods. Chaos ensues. The first clap of thunder cracked the night wide open. By 9 p.m., the sky over Crestwood Estates had turned into a swirling mass of black clouds. Rain fell in heavy sheets, hammering roofs like fists on a door. This wasn't a drizzle. This was a storm with intent. Lena Carter rushed to tape plastic over her living room windows, her hands shaking. The wind howled through the trees like something alive. Her son clutched his toy car wide-eyed. "Mommy, it's louder than last time," he whispered. "I know, baby." "Stay close," she replied, pulling him behind the couch. Across the street, Harold Jennings was already outside, flashlight in hand, raincoat zipped to his neck. The water was rising faster than he had ever seen. His boots splashed through ankle-deep puddles that were becoming streams. He aimed the beam toward the concrete channel where the creek once flowed. What he saw made his stomach drop. The drainage grates were completely submerged. Water wasn't flowing through the system anymore. It was boiling up from it, as if the earth itself had reversed. A distant alarm wailed. It wasn't a siren. It was the HOA's newly installed flood sensors, which had never been tested in a real storm. Their lights blinked red, frantic, useless. By 10:45 p.m., the neighborhood was drowning. Cars floated in driveways like forgotten toys. Mailboxes vanished beneath brown water. People shouted from porches, flashlights slicing through the darkness. Some tried to build makeshift barriers with sandbags. Others dragged their pets and children to higher ground. The HOA office, perched on a slightly raised lot, remained lit, Inside, board members huddled around a conference table, phones buzzing, arguments overlapping. "This isn't our fault," Susan Marwick snapped. "The system was supposed to hold," someone shouted back. Outside, water began seeping through the front door. The real breaking point came at 11:22 p.m. A low rumble rolled through Crestwood, deep and guttural. Then came a sound like tearing fabric, magnified 100 times. The retention wall at the far end of the drainage channel cracked. A slab of concrete shifted, then collapsed entirely. The water, held back for weeks, searching for a path, surged forward like a released beast. It ripped through fences, backyards, patios. Garden sheds floated away. Trash bins spun like whirlpools. A swing set toppled over, swallowed by the flood. Harold ran toward Lena's house, the flashlight jerking wildly. "Lena, you've got to get out, now!" he yelled over the roar. She grabbed her son and waded into the water. It reached her waist within seconds. "Help! Over here!" Neighbors formed human chains, gripping each other's arms. Inching their way toward higher ground, the only safe area left was the small hill near the elementary school at the edge of the neighborhood. The HOA board finally evacuated when water breached their lobby. Susan looked back through the glass doors as chairs floated past. Her modernization project was being ripped apart, piece by piece. By midnight, Crestwood Estates was unrecognizable. Streetlights flickered and died. The sound of rushing water drowned out everything else. And in the heart of it all, where a quiet creek once flowed, lay a broken wall and a roaring, uncontrolled current, reclaiming what had always been its own. The creek that held a community together. Introduction of the neighborhood. The creek's historical and environmental importance, HOA's decision to fill it, and the initial reactions of residents. Blackman's Creek wasn't just a body of water, it was the heart of the neighborhood. Winding gently behind rows of mid-century homes, its surface reflected golden sunlight in the mornings and silver moonlight at night. Kids caught tadpoles there every summer. Families held picnics along its banks, and older residents often sat on benches beside it, listening to the steady trickle that had been part of their lives for decades. No one could quite say how the creek got its name. Some claimed it was named after Elijah Black, a freedman who had settled near the water after the Civil War. Others thought it was just a local colloquialism that stuck. Whatever its origin, Blackman's Creek was woven into the identity of Crestwood Estates. Then came the new HOA board. After last year's election, a new set of board members swept in, determined to modernize Crestwood. Their meetings were filled with phrases like property value, streamlining aesthetics, and maximizing space. The creek, they said, was outdated and an underutilized resource. In one heated session, the HOA president, Susan Marwick, presented a bold plan: fill in the creek with concrete to make way for a new community greenbelt and parking extensions. The proposal shocked many. Environmental concerns were brushed off. "It's just a ditch," Susan said dismissively. "We can turn it into something better." A few long-time residents, like Harold Jennings, a retired postal worker who'd lived there for 42 years, stood up to object. "That creek is part of this land," he argued. "You fill it, you change everything. The water has to go somewhere." But the board had already decided. They rushed the vote through in a poorly attended meeting during a rainy Thursday night. With only 12 votes in favor, they approved a budget allocation of $230,000 for creek conversion. Within weeks, trucks and bulldozers arrived. The once lush banks were torn apart. Concrete mixers lined the streets, pouring heavy gray sludge where minnows once swam. The sound of flowing water was replaced by the grating noise of jackhammers and cement trucks. Children watched from their windows as their summer hideaway was turned into a sterile, lifeless trench. Some residents protested by placing "Save the Creek" signs on their lawns, but the HOA issued citations for unauthorized signage. By late autumn, the creek was gone. In its place lay a long concrete channel with drainage pipes. The HOA proudly held a ribbon-cutting ceremony. There were balloons, speeches about progress, and promises that this change would increase property values by 15%. But as winter rains came, something changed. Water that used to flow downstream now pooled in strange places. Lawns that had been dry for decades turned soggy. Basements began to smell musty. Harold Jennings watched nervously as puddles grew larger behind his fence. The creek was gone, but the water was still there. Focus on the first heavy rains after the creek was filled, the unnoticed warning signs, residents' reactions, and the HOA's dismissive attitude. The first rainfall came quietly. A soft drizzle swept across Crestwood Estates one grey morning in late December, wrapping the neighborhood in a misty calm. It wasn't anything unusual. Winter rains had always been part of life here. But this time, without the creek, the rain had nowhere to go. Harold Jennings noticed it first. From his kitchen window, he saw the water in his backyard rising steadily, swirling around his garden shed. At first, he thought it was just a clogged gutter. But as hours passed, the puddle became a pool, one that crept toward his back steps with silent determination. Across the street, the Ramirez family woke to find their basement carpet damp. Little Sophia complained of a weird smell, and when Mr. Ramirez pulled up a floorboard, a thin stream of water trickled out like a wound that had just opened. But the rain kept coming. By afternoon, it was a steady downpour, drumming against roofs and overflowing newly installed concrete drains. The so-called community greenbelt turned into a shallow lake. The parking area, which the HOA had proudly paved over the old creek, began to fill like a bowl. The HOA's official message arrived via email at 4:37 p.m. Subject: temporary rain accumulation, no cause for alarm. Dear residents, due to seasonal rainfall, you may notice minor pooling in some areas. Our new drainage system is designed to handle runoff efficiently. Please do not tamper with or obstruct any drains. Regards, Crestwood Estates HOA Board Minor Pooling. That's what they called it. By evening, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the trees. Emergency weather alerts buzzed on everyone's phones. Flash flood warnings lit up TV screens. And in Crestwood, water moved where it had never moved before, creeping beneath fences, sliding under doors, seeping through foundations. Lena Carter, a single mother living near the old creek bed, tried to push her front door open against the rising water. It fought her like an invisible force, the current swirling through her porch. "Mommy, the water's inside!" Her son screamed from the living room as it began to pool around their feet. Harold grabbed his old rubber boots and flashlight, stepping out into knee-deep water that used to be his lawn. The air smelled of wet soil and something else, something stale and stagnant, like water that didn't belong. Neighbors gathered on porches, calling to one another over the roar of the storm. Flashlights flickered like fireflies in the dark. "This never happened before," someone shouted. "Not in 40 years. By midnight, the water had spread across several streets. Yards became ponds, basements became shallow wells, and still the HOA board maintained silence. Their temporary rain accumulation statement unchanged. Harold stood beneath his umbrella, staring at the solid grey ribbon of concrete that had replaced the creek. Water slapped against its edges, unable to escape. He felt a chill, not from the rain, but from the realization settling in his bones. The creek hadn't needed them. But they had always needed the creek.